My name is Core, and this is my co-host here, Dab. This is a review for chapter 215. So, what are your thoughts on this chapter, Dab?
For chapter 215, I was hoping for a little bit more of a climax battle, kind of like you saw with Bakugo in his fight for the fourth fight, but with what was going on with Deku in the previous chapters in his Cork. I guess it's not surprising that we ended up in a fight where that ended up being very close. As you know, in the chapter he had to use 8%, but starting at the beginning, the big eye opener there was the fact that he is really alluding to how he's improved on his heart, the scene on the beach, how he's kind of grown. And I'm very curious on that as he's been unlocking things and all that. We've always assumed it's because he's been training his body. We always see him, lifting weights, doing something, to exert himself physically. But we really haven't seen that emotional growth unless it's been accidental here and there where he's determined to do something to get this done, to get that done, save that person, and all that. So we don't necessarily always see kind of like a heart growth. I'm not sure what to call that per se, but we haven't really seen that inner development.
Yeah, definitely the mental capacity part of it is definitely a big factor here. It's not. It seems like it's not just the physical aspect to get to a higher level past 20%. It's all the mental aspect too. I think once he starts thinking like the predecessor and his heart starts growing like he starts feeling is using his feelings like the predecessor. I think the one for all is going to grow once he starts learning how to use that. It's going to get better.
Exactly. And this time around, the interesting thing in this chapter was instead of Eraserhead telling you to wait and see what happens, it was All Might this time. So he's definitely showing signs that he's curious about what's going on because he must know it has something to do with One for All. So I was very surprised to see him say wait. That, of course, I'm sure he'll have a talk with Deku coming up probably here in chapter 216. But I imagine he won't just sideline him. I imagine they'll probably have Deku go see the nurse, see what's going on with that, just in case anything's unusual going on with his body. They're definitely going to want to know what's going on, so I think All Might will kind of sneak off or escort him to the nurse there. But it was very much of a change from Eraserhead wanting to stop it or not wanting to stop it. He seemed almost more interested in stopping it this time around than he did in chapter 214.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting in the next chapter. Eraserhead is definitely going to want answers, and he's a very sharp guy. So it's going to be interesting to see what he asks Deku and how Deku explains this, because I mean, the only thing I could think of that how Deku could explain this is saying that his quirk mutated. Yeah, it's going to be very interesting. Eventually, I think they're going to have to tell Eraserhead about One for All, but I wonder how quickly that'll happen because of the worries about having a traitor.
Exactly. With that, we know if, of course, anyone were to find out outside of the two classes and teachers, it definitely means that the traitor that we've all been hunting for and pointing fingers is definitely in that group of about 43, 44, I guess, if you include Midnight, who's kind of taken a back seat in this chapter. We didn't see any of her there, but she's definitely present. So there's about 44 people that are witnessing this, including Deku. And the interesting part is, of course, once he used it, his body was, of course, racked with pain, showing that it's too powerful for him. So I don't know if that means it's got its own separate scale of what's considered to be 100%, if it was just the first time activating it. So we don't know what strength exactly that quirk was unleashed at, whether it was 100 or if we saw when it was rampaging, if that was 100 and this was just 20%. So it'll be curious to see how that develops, because it sounds like he's going to have to train each of the quirks that he's getting and then manifesting probably individually, so that way he can get them all on tiers. So it's not just going to be one of those things where he can focus on One for All. He's going to have to individually train and grow every quirk, and in the long run, it'll definitely benefit him. So we'll probably see instances where the other quirks manifest and he can't use them as well as he probably would need to in the given situation, but probably just enough to get him through those situations.
It's interesting because Deku gives out the hint until he's unable to fully unleash One for All and control it, which means that maybe 100%. That's what I was hinting at. But does this quirk really need 100% of One for All to be able to control it? That's the big question. What percentage does it need?
Exactly. I can see it leveling. Basically, I can see leveling up one quirk helping him with One for All. So I think he's going to have to master one before he can move on to the next, or not even necessarily master, but at least be able to use it for prolonged amounts of time. Because even going off of how he's gotten to 20%, I mean, it's almost taken 3/4 of the school year just to get to 20%. So if that's the case for this quirk, you're looking at another 6 to 7 months there worth of time that he doesn't necessarily have. So we'll see how that develops, and with every quirk, how they fall into the mix and how it all comes together. The most interesting part will be determining, if he activates 20 of one for all, does it activate 20% of that? Or can he activate that, and then of course working towards can he multi-activate and going from there, because so far I'm not quite sure if he can, but we'll find out, I'm sure, down the road. He did decide though to go with 8% of his power for the fight, because of course he was worried that activating 20% would of course make him lose control again, especially with his air burst, and of course he doesn't want to make anybody destroyed or crushed by his power. That's not the point, because even when he discusses it with All Might, All Might tells him, I'm not always using all my power 100% of the time. That would lead to mass destruction and probably fatalities. But of course, Deku would do anything to avoid that.
Yeah, I know it's probably a little bit disappointing for people that he couldn't show off his new abilities, especially how we saw that fight in the previous arc was very, very entertaining. So I'm sure he's going to be able to show it off soon to everyone, which will be a shock. It's definitely interesting to see Monoma, and this goes back to the previous chapter of why couldn't he um is the bluff of him using one for all because he couldn't copy it, or was it too powerful for him to copy it, or was that the original plan and he never tried? Because I really want to confirm if he could copy or not, because that'd be really interesting.
See, I'm curious on that as well, because in the battle, the flashback in this chapter shows him hitting Deku what appears to be on the right side of his face or even his arm. And I'm confused on that, because when Deku takes the shot in the side of the face, it appears to be on his left side. So that wouldn't make any sense if double impact doesn't impact on an item in the same spot that it was impacted on. So I'd be curious on how he hit him in the left side of the face compared to the right when he slapped him, or whatever was going on there. Since we've got the distance, we can't really get a good look. So I'd be curious if maybe what he thought was a dud was him accidentally pulling off a very weak air blast and hitting Deku in the face. But we didn't see anything like that, and Deku didn't seem to have a reaction. So unless it was extremely, extremely light force, because as we know, 20% is what activates that kind of air burst because you've got enough strength. But even technically flicking your finger, even now as a weak human being, you can feel the wind coming off of it. So if he activated, let's say, 8% and accidentally pulled it off, that might push enough air to create a small impact against Deku's face. Just not one that would be noticeable, probably like getting tickled by a feather, but you amplify it by 6 or 7 times and it quickly becomes like getting punched in the face.
When he first attended high school, Eraserhead was able to erase Deku's one for all. So if he could do that, it's definitely listed as an official quirk. But Monoma might not be at the level yet where he could copy such a powerful quirk. And that's one thing I want to see confirmed. Like, I want to see like Monoma actually try and copy his quirk. That is the most interesting stuff for me. One of the most interesting that I've seen in the past couple of chapters that leads to this one too.
And we know he's definitely strengthened his quirk, because he mentions that he's increased it to 4, that he can now do it up to 10 minutes, or at least beyond that. He, of course, states how if he uses certain quirks and then changes certain things that don't necessarily affect his body, he can still stay in play and continue to do it, referencing the nut. So, we definitely know that when he came in there, he definitely had all of his team's quirks. So we know he would have had to have traded one off to continue to have probably the most useful ones, which of course were the Poltergeist, the Brainwash, Double Impact, and then of course took over Deku's. So he would have had to abandon the size one, which we can tell happens that he would have abandoned that, because when the pipe, even though he has to make physical contact with it, if you're in control of it, you might as well float it past your hand real quickly while she's not noticing it. Do a smaller item rather than such a large pipe, and then just hit her with a larger thing when she's not really paying attention. So we kind of saw that would end up being that route, but of course he kind of throws out there that he thinks that he could easily take Ochako in a fight, who quickly turns around and shows him that she's strong now, and there's no doubt about it. She's definitely MVP of the fight in my honest opinion, because she ends up taking down three different people in the fight relatively easily. She definitely filled in her role with combat by going to Gunhead and learning those martial arts. She definitely improved on an area where she had definitely mentioned she was lacking chapters ago, and seeing such a development from her is very good, because I'd hate to think that she just becomes like a backdoor superhero that doesn't really get to see those combat things and all that, but she understands that she needs to be able to be useful in almost every situation, whether it's a rescue or a fight, that she can be there to help other heroes. And I think that's ultimately what her goal is at this point now, is to be useful to everybody.
Yeah, Ochako, they were all impressive. Ochako especially, she's definitely come a long way, and I think Deku is her inspiration. So that's very, seeing the growth for her is pretty much amazing.
And of course, we also saw how Deku's team had planned. Now they were using sign language to still be able to communicate, and that doesn't have any effect with the brainwash quirk. So that'll be interesting on how Shinzo develops against enemies that are more prepared for his brainwashing and using verbal commands and things, or non-verbal commands, especially if you were to say, for example, if he was up against a more trained military group that are going to be using more visual symbols and stuff, how he would take them on when he's at a disadvantage there, because that renders him quirkless. And as we saw on a one-on-one fight, when his quirk becomes useless, he's not quite ready yet for direct combat. Interesting choice that he made, of course, was falling back, trying to lead Deku to his group so that way he could get them involved in the melee, and that way he could probably take advantage of the melee to maybe get some of them brainwashed. But my comparison to that was I thought of the fight with Muscular, when Deku thought, oh, I could lead him back to Eraserhead. He's like, no, I can't do that. He's going to be too fast. He'll catch me. And goes through that whole thing. Shinzo, kind of went through the same spiel and came up with the conclusion it'd be safer to run. I think his honest opinion would have been better to delay Deku, because it created an unusual development with his team. But I think if he would have taken Deku out himself, and I think from there helped his team out a little bit better, crowd controlling.
And also, you gotta have, once you see Mineta in a panel, there's gonna be some perverted fan service in there.
Exactly. He and Ishida, I'm actually very impressed. I wouldn't think that, for one, I always think of Mineta as being very weak and not very useful, because his quirk is a giant purple ball. You can't miss him. So they're this pretty avoidable item, and his stature doesn't really help him for combat, because he's the size of like a 6-year-old. For Ishida, we haven't really seen her fight a lot, and her with her acid, yeah, it gives her mobility and all that, but I imagine she has to be particularly careful, because splashing people with acid can't be good. So we haven't really seen those two shine, but seeing them hold their own in a 3 vs 2, especially against people that are mostly long range and able to suppress, was actually rather impressive. I was actually very intrigued by their development, and I think with them they'll continue to grow, and of course develop their quirks in ways that you wouldn't consider useful as far as combat goes. But as we've seen, Mineta can easily turn his items into weapons that can stick together and don't affect him, so he can definitely come up with his own binding quirks or fighting style that definitely uses that.
The fact that he could make it into a trampoline so he could move around like that, it's actually quite impressive.
It gives him a good amount of mobility when you think about it, because if he had to hop from an area, all he has to do is throw it ahead of himself as he's moving along, and he easily jump between walls. He could, in all honesty, if he trained hard enough, he could probably move like Deku did in the fight with Stain. So that'd be very interesting to see a very tiny Mineta taking on someone in like an alleyway and just pinging all over the place like a pinball.
If he could learn some martial arts, he would be tough to beat.
Exactly, with timing and placement, he could easily trick them into situations where he's attached balls to them and they don't realize it. Next thing you know, they're attached to something. But that also comes with limits, because I imagine if he stuck one on, like, say, Deku's arm, and then Deku got stuck to the wall, I imagine Deku could just rip the wall right off and still have it just be attached to him would be the only problem there. So he does have downsides against strength quirks or ones that can destroy the ball, things like that.
If Mineta could train himself where somehow he could pick the people that won't stick to the balls, that would be a crazy advantage if he could do that in the future.
Exactly, because we know with his development, he mostly went for being able to use it without bleeding. So that will be good for endurance. But now he's got to use it without looking like he's just randomly scattering them everywhere. There's got to be a little bit more planning and skill to it, and I think we'll see that development definitely coming after this fight. And I'm sure Eraserhead will probably tell him that was Monetta's biggest downfall was there was no real plan for him and his cork, that he needs
The,
to really develop that.
the most shocking thing about this fight is that the three partners of Deku, they all outshine. I think they all outshined him this match. I was not expecting. I was expecting Deku to outshine everyone.
Oh, exactly. I expected him to go in 20%, just blow everyone out of the water. It'd kind of like a Bakugo match again, and just cream everyone on the opposite team. But I guess with the development of the cork, that was a good way to prevent that fight from becoming just another real quick match. Horikoshi did a great job with doing something like that, bringing Deku kind of back to reality and kind of bringing him back to the normalcy for school. Because out in the fight, yeah, it was kind of like on the spot, 20%. It hurt, and then with Gentle, he was able to do it and all that. But once again, with the fight with Gentle, very clear determination. But this time around, I think with the comment from Monomu definitely triggered him, and then the cork manifested as a way to not only protect Monomu but also stop Deku from making him a huge mistake. So it brought it back. I was hoping for a different conclusion of the chapter with a lot bigger fight of him copying it. I was really anticipating that, and him just going gung ho against and really putting team pressure on Team A. But for most of it, it was kind of back and forth pressure with, of course, Ochako coming out of nowhere and taking out three of them on her own. So that was definitely the real dark horse there. But I'm definitely with the other two, because he was going into it with three people that are all support corks. In all honesty, they're not supposed to be super combat useful, but yet they proved to be extremely useful with the 2-on-3, with the takedown of three, and so on. But Deku, of course, being hindered by his body going through the changes that it's going through.
I was really, really impressed of how unpredictable this chapter was, and this whole fight, this whole matchup was. The fact that Deku didn't pull another Bakugo and just dominate. I was expecting that. But he did a great job of making it unpredictable.
I'd probably say, for even though I had bigger expectations, still not a bad chap. Very tame for what I expected this last match, because each one, you start off with the first one, you had some minor injuries here and there, some hurt feelings, things like that. But as you went from, to the second one to the third one and then to the fourth one, like the intensity of them was getting out of control. And then this one really brought it back to kind of like reality of kind of like what you'd expect to see, a match between, teams. No one was horribly beat up. I think at this point the one that took the most damage was once again Deku, proving to Eraserhead that Deku knows how to get himself beat up in any given situation. But not a bad chapter. If I had to rate it from 1 to 10, I'd probably put it at about a 6.5 or a 7. But once again, we know you can't really compete with chapter 213 with how that one came out of nowhere. But not bad. Ultimately, I'm glad that Class A won. I hope this means Shinzo will end up in Class A, because I think there's a lot of things he can learn from the students in that class in particular.
Well, for sure, I think Shinso is going to end up in Class A, because especially with Deku. I mean, if Deku goes off like this, he's the only one that could really get him in control of. I think too, when Deku talks to All Might is going to plead for Shinso to be in Class A, just to help out Deku when he has these moments. But let's see how All Might convinces other teachers. I mean, he's gonna have to have an excuse. It's gonna be interesting what his excuse is, And if I was to give this a rating, I would say I would give it a 7 or 7.5. I would say 7.5. I mean, chapter 213 was a 10 out of 10. I mean, when you give a chapter a 10 out of 10, you gotta always remember that chapter. And I will always remember that chapter because of all that new info that we got from about One for All. So this wraps up our review for chapter 215, and we'll see you guys next time. Thank you.
And if you like what you heard, definitely make sure to click the like button down at the bottom and subscribe.